Let's talk defense.
You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and thank you for making us your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day, and we are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And folks, we all know that Syracuse football needs a quarterback. It's the priority number one of this offseason, right? So we've been talking a lot of quarterbacks here on the Locked On Syracuse podcast recently. And I've kind of been neglecting defense a little bit, right? We talked about it in the transfer portal needs, right? We talked about that earlier in the portal season. So today, we're talking mostly defense. Sound good? Because fortunately, while maybe I have been neglecting defense in the transfer portal, Fran Brown and company have not. Okay? That's the good news right there. We're going to talk about AJ Pena visiting Syracuse. He's an edge rusher. Chris Thomas being offered. He's in the portal right now. Plus, later on in the show, other portal news that, well, we could just jumble in together into one segment. That's what's coming up on this edition of the Locked On Syracuse podcast. And before we get to everything, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel, and you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Syracuse football is looking at Rhode Island edge rusher AJ Pena. Now, Rhode Island, they do play at the FCS level, but I will explain later on in this segment while, yes, it is FCS, that is definitely a step below FBS. This guy can still be a pretty good player. AJ Pena. 24/7 Sports is reporting that Pena is visiting Syracuse on the 16th, which, for those that are watching on Sunday night, that's tomorrow, the 16th, okay? Pena is listed at 6'2", 245 pounds, and I believe he would have 1 year of eligibility left. He is a New Jersey kid, and he is coming off a ridiculous season where he had 12 sacks, 22 and a half tackles for loss, and 83 total tackles. He was an FCS All-American and currently rated as a top 150 transfer portal player so far on 24/7 Sports. For what it's worth, I looked at Rhode Island's schedule this past season. They did play one Power 4 team, and that was Minnesota. In that game, Pena had 7 tackles and 1 sack. We are talking AJ Pena visiting Syracuse tomorrow. If you are watching this on the 15th, he is a Rhode Island edge rusher. And I really like this idea if Syracuse were, of course, to seal the deal and get AJ Pena tomorrow. I would love if they can just sign this kid right when he visits. Pena profiles as a pass rusher. And Syracuse football certainly needs pass rushers because remember, Fidel Diggs, who led the team with 7.5 sacks this year, he's out of eligibility. So he cannot come back. He was the Texas A&M transfer. We had high hopes for him, and he certainly delivered this season. But where are the sacks going to come from next year? Perhaps it's AJ Pena. Now, they do have, I should say, they do have 4-star King Joseph Edwards. He was a 4-star in the 2024 recruiting cycle. He's waiting in the wings, and we saw a glimpse of what King Joseph Edwards can be. They were playing Holy Cross, and in the fourth quarter, he had 3 sacks. Just in one quarter, it was the only real substantial playing time he got this season. So I'm looking forward to seeing what he can do. But even if, let's say, King Joseph Edwards does step in and is a starting edge rusher for this team next season, you still need another one, and that could be AJ Pena. And we all know, if you have been following along this podcast, talking about transfer portal needs, linebacker is a big need for this team. Justin Barron is out of eligibility. Marlo Wax is out of eligibility. AJ Pena, for what it's worth, Anwar Sparrow, who could have been a backup linebacker next season, he's entering the transfer portal. AJ Pena doesn't necessarily profile as a Justin Barron or a Marlo Wax. He is an edge rusher, but you do need linebackers. And he is a linebacker. And I think he profiles more to fill the void of Fadil Diggs. And it's possible that next season, assuming that Syracuse will stick with a 4-3, they can have Pena and Edwards on the two edges. So I really like this idea. Now, as far as the FCS, I promised you guys earlier in the show here that I was going to bring that up, and I was going to tell you why, yes, it is FCS. I'm not too concerned about it. While he was at the FCS, Pena dominated, okay? I'm not going to sit here and try to tell you that AJ Pena is going to be an All-American like he was at the FCS level next year. I'm not going to try to convince you of that, because even myself, I don't believe that. That's a really, really tough jump to make. However, it's like I said with Brady Norton, the offensive lineman, on Friday, on that Poll Friday episode. If you missed it, be sure to check it out. We talked about how offensive line is the number one need for this team outside of quarterback. Brady Norton is a guy that's visiting Syracuse. He's from Cal Poly. That's FCS, but he was dominant at the FCS level. So I believe he deserves a chance at the Power 4, and it's the same thing with a guy like AJ Pena. Yeah, he's FCS. Obviously, you'd rather a guy who played at the FBS. Obviously, you'd rather someone like Fadil Diggs coming from Texas A&M as a starter. But I believe that AJ Pena deserves a chance. Also, did a little bit of homework for you guys. We don't have to go too far to find edge rushers having success at the Power 4 level coming from smaller schools. You don't have to go too far, guys. Jared Verse. Do you remember him? You might remember the name. He transferred to Florida State after 2 seasons with UAlbany. UAlbany, FCS. He transferred to Florida State. In 2021, he had 9 sacks with UAlbany. In 2022, Jared Verse, 8 sacks with Florida State. In 2023, Verse had 9 sacks with Florida State. What does that mean? It can certainly be done, where a guy goes from FCS edge rusher to a Power 4 edge rusher. And by the way, Jared Verse, for what it's worth, became a first-round pick in last year's NFL draft to the LA Rams. It can be done. And you don't have to go too far to find it. What else? Is there another one that you can name? Well, I got one for you. You remember Jermaine Johnson? Jermaine Johnson, a 2022 first-round pick of the New York Jets. I'm a New York Jets fan, and honestly, that's probably the worst thing that's ever happened to Jermaine Johnson, being drafted by the Jets. But aside from that, he started his career at JUCO. He started at JUCO level. He transferred to Georgia, then went to Florida State, and eventually became a first-round pick. So I just named you 2 edge rushers in the past few years that came from lower level, i.e. FCS or a JUCO, played well after in the Power 4 level. So it can be done. I am not going to convince you that AJ Pena is going to be the next Jared Verse or Jermaine Johnson. Those were first-round picks at Florida State. They were studs. But I believe that AJ Pena could be a competent pass rusher at the Power 4 level. And for what it's worth, he does have other Power 4 offers. He's got an offer from Nebraska, Illinois, Wisconsin, and others. Those are Big Ten schools. Syracuse is not the only team that's interested in a guy like AJ Pena. He's a New Jersey kid. He's from Rhode Island. I can't see why Syracuse can't get this done. And I believe they can. If I had to make a prediction on where he's going to land, I would say he's going to end up with Syracuse, but I don't have inside knowledge on that. So overall, I like it. They need a pass rusher. Even if they didn't, you would never say no to a pass rusher regardless. And I think AJ Pena from Rhode Island, an FCS All-American, could be a perfect fit. Leave a comment in the comment section below your thoughts on AJ Pena. And like I said at the top of the podcast, luckily that Syracuse is not neglecting defense like I seem to be on the podcast in recent days. Coming up, we'll talk about another defensive player. We're going to talk about someone who didn't play at the FCS level, but played a step above. He played at Group of 5, Chris Thomas. He was recently offered. He's a defensive lineman. We'll talk about him next on the Locked On Syracuse podcast. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Syracuse football, they are playing in the Holiday Bowl against Washington State on December 27th. FanDuel currently has the Orange as 7.5-point favorites. And I think it's in large part because Kyle McCord recently announced that he is going to play in the bowl game. What do you think of those odds? Well, you can just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. I'm Jackson Holzer, and this is Locked On Syracuse. And on today's show, we are talking about a couple of defenders that the Orange are targeting in the transfer portal. Edge rusher from Rhode Island, AJ Pena. He is visiting Syracuse. If you are watching this on the 15th, he is visiting the Orange tomorrow. He's an FCS All-American. I just talked about how I think he could be a perfect fit for the Orange. Now, let's talk about a defensive tackle from Marshall. Marshall, of course, having huge problems with their football program. Syracuse football appears to be targeting Marshall defensive tackle Chris Thomas Jr. in the transfer portal. Thomas is 6'6", 330 pounds, and he is a run-stuffing defensive tackle. That sounds pretty nice. What do you think? Run-stuffing defensive tackle. I think they can use that. I'll explain why later on here in this segment. Thomas has spent the last 2 years at Marshall and the previous 2 seasons at Florida. He's got 1 more year of eligibility remaining, and he posted on his Twitter account, so I'm getting this information from Chris Thomas himself, that Syracuse has put out an offer for him. That means they're interested. Clearly, right? Again, it's coming from Chris Thomas himself on Twitter. I also do believe he is the older brother of a 2025 commit for the Orange, Eric Thomas. So that could be pretty cool having the siblings. And Eric Thomas is also a defensive lineman for what it's worth. But back to Chris. He had a solid year last season with Marshall. He's a starting defensive tackle, over 40 tackles, 4 tackles for loss. And Marshall, by the way, went 10-3 this season. They were a pretty good team in the Sun Belt, so that's good. You're getting a starter potentially from, it's a group of 5, but still could be good. And I like his size at 6'6", 330 pounds. That's size that can translate to a power 4 level. Overall, you can never have enough defensive line depth. Like you just can't. Can you? Is there such thing as enough? I don't think so. I think the cornerstone of the defensive line is Murad Watson. Murad Watson was a true freshman this past season, and I honestly didn't have high expectations for him. He was a consensus 3-star guy, but he was a starter for Syracuse, and recently, by 24/7 Sports, he was named a true freshman All-American. So he's clearly the building block of this defensive line, Murad Watson. But a guy like Chris Thomas could be the perfect pairing alongside of him. And like I said, with his size, he should be able to translate to the power 4 level. And he spent 2 seasons at Florida as well. He didn't really play at Florida, but he was there. And he was at Marshall, which is group of 5. I also don't know necessarily if Chris Thomas would start if he were to commit to Syracuse, because if you're looking at the depth, there's Rashard Perry, Isaiah Hastings, there's others, but also a guy like Dion Wilson. Dion Wilson this year, nicknamed Tank Wilson, I believe he was a transfer from New Mexico. He had 1 more year of eligibility left, but he dealt with injuries this season, and he only played in 4 games, which is below or right at the threshold for what you need for a redshirt year. It's 4 or less games. So I'm very curious to know if Dion Wilson has another year of eligibility. But regardless, I mean, you're not going to say no to Chris Thomas just because Dion Wilson might be back. The other thing I like about Thomas, and I said this already, but he is a run-stuffing defensive tackle. And the Orange certainly need someone like that. They do. Look at the numbers from last season. What was the big weakness of Syracuse? What was it? If you followed along, 9-win regular season, could be 10 wins in the bowl game. They were pretty good at a lot of things. Obviously, you got to be pretty good in order to win 9 games. Except they did a really not so great job of stopping the run. Compared to the rest of the ACC, Syracuse led up the 3rd most rushing yards per game. Already not off to a great start. But what if teams were just running the ball a lot on Syracuse just because? For the fun of it, right? Well, if you look at yards per carry, which might be a better stat to use, the Orange were the only team in the ACC to let up over 5 yards per carry. It was like Syracuse at 5.2. Clemson, shockingly, is the second worst. They're at like 4.6, though. 5.2 yards per carry. Think about that for a moment. That means that an opponent could run 2 run plays on average and get a first down. So they need some run stuffing in there. They need some meat in the middle. And I think a guy like Chris Thomas could be a perfect fit for this team. So my overall thoughts on this, I think there's still a while to go while he's been offered. I am not sure if a visit is in order yet. I imagine there will be. I mean, he's the older brother of a Syracuse 2025 commit. It makes a lot of sense. Syracuse can use a defensive lineman. He's coming from Marshall. They were a pretty good team in the group of 5. He was a starter. This could be a good move. I like it. Leave a comment in the comments section below your thoughts on Chris Thomas. Do you think that he would automatically start for the Orange next season? And how do you like the fit? And honestly, how many defensive linemen do they need in the portal? I think that's a legitimate question, because if they get Chris Thomas, they might be set at defensive line for next season. So overall, I like it. I'm Jackson Holzer. This is Locked On Syracuse. We have gone over 2 defensive players in the transfer portal for Syracuse that the Orange have been connected to. AJ Pena from Rhode Island, and now what we just talked about, Chris Thomas from Marshall, the defensive tackle. Coming up, some other portal news to catch you up on. It's that time of year. The college football playoff is back, and with the newly expanded 12-team format, it's guaranteed to be bigger and better than ever, bringing you all the hard-hitting and high-flying excitement that you love. TNT Sports coverage of the college football playoff begins December 21st, starting with the college football playoff kickoff show presented by AT&T at 11 a.m. Eastern, leading into our first matchup, the Southern Methodist University Mustangs battling the Penn State Nittany Lions at noon. Then the Clemson Tigers look to upset the Texas Longhorns in a showdown at 4 p.m. Eastern. Don't miss a moment of the action. Watch the college football playoff presented by Allstate live on TNT, True TV, TBS, and Max. Here is some other transfer portal news to catch you up on going on with Syracuse, okay? First and foremost, sorry guys, we're going back to talking about quarterbacks. It's a big priority. We have to talk about it here because I don't know who the 2025 starter is going to be, okay? Kaidon Salter, perhaps the most talked about of the bunch. He visited Syracuse yesterday. He was in attendance of the Syracuse-Georgetown game with Fran Brown. And look, I know the Orange need a quarterback, but I have to ask this sincerely. I mean, can Kaidon Salter hoop? Can he hoop? Because honestly, we might need some basketball players. Can he coach basketball? That's what I want to know too. Can he coach? Can he play? We might need that more than we need a quarterback, but that's neither here nor there. And in all seriousness, of all the quarterbacks that Syracuse has been linked to, keyword is linked, okay? He's not my number one priority when you look at the landscape of the portal. But of the guys that Syracuse is linked to, which is now 3 since Connor Wigman came off the board to Houston, Kaidon Salter is my number one target. You got Salter, you got Ricky Collins from LSU. I don't love that idea. And Anthony Calandria from Virginia. The only real positive with Anthony Calandria is that he's got experience in the ACC starting. But just because he has experience doesn't mean it's good experience. Kaidon Salter, in my opinion, of those 3 options, he clearly has the highest floor and the highest ceiling of all of them. It's not even close. And I saw someone comment that I'm a clown and that I have no idea. Yeah, actually, this person said that I should be banned because he's coming from the group of five. And why would I push the narrative that Syracuse should go after a group of five quarterback? First of all, look, I get the concern that Kaidon Salter is coming from the group of five because it's certainly different than the power four. We have seen quarterbacks struggle to take that next step. Go look at Grayson McCall trying to make that step for NC State last season before he got hurt. He wasn't very good. There is a big difference between power four competition and playing at Liberty. Big difference. But that doesn't mean that guys from the group of five cannot succeed at the next level. It does not mean that quarterbacks cannot succeed at the power four level. Whatever you do, if you believe that narrative, go look up where Indiana's Curtis Rourke went to college the previous 5 years. Go look at it. I'll tell you the answer. It's the Ohio Bobcats. He was the 2022 MAC Player of the Year. I don't know really what he did in 2023, but in 2024, he transferred to Indiana. Indiana's 11-1, and guess what? They're in the college football playoff. And correct me if I'm wrong, he finished top 10 in Heisman voting. Is Kaidon Salter next year with Syracuse going to finish top 10 in Heisman voting? The odds are stacked against him. It's very difficult to finish top 10 in Heisman voting. You got to be one of the 10 best players in college football in order for that to happen. But the argument that, hey, he's coming from group of five, he can't be good, is just wrong. It's incorrect. We literally saw it this season. That's Curtis Rourke at Indiana. So overall, Kaidon Salter, he's my number one target. He visited Syracuse yesterday. What else do we got? We got Malachi Hosley from Penn. Not Penn State, from Penn, the Ivy League. So this guy's a smart kid coming from the Ivy League. He's got a visit, I believe, lined up with Syracuse. I think that's from 24/7 Sports reporting that. He's a running back. And obviously with the Quint Allen status kind of up in the air, the staff does kind of have to dot their I's, cross their T's at the position. Allen does have another year left of eligibility, but really the question with him comes down to, is he going to go to the NFL or not? It's kind of similar to a Rondé Gadsden at tight end, but I think Gadsden's pretty much a lock to go to the NFL. Allen less so. I don't have odds on this, but I can see either way, him staying or him going pro. So that's why you got to look at potentially another running back. What else? We'll go back to defense here. Julian Humphrey, the Georgia corner. It's kind of funny because with Fran Brown's background, every single player from Georgia that enters the portal, we immediately say, ooh, that could be a fit at Syracuse, right? And for good reason. I mean, Fran Brown, like I said, the Georgia background is real. He was the defensive backs coach there. He was the number one recruiter in the nation at Georgia. So he knows a lot of these guys on that roster. Here's the issue with Julian Humphrey. He's a cornerback, and he was a stud at Georgia, but I don't know what exactly happened. I think he got benched. Maybe he just wasn't playing well in the end. And he's not with the team anymore, even though they're in the college football playoff. He's in the portal, and he's got a ton of offers, but Syracuse is not one of the teams that has offered Julian Humphrey, which is surprising. He's a defensive back. I think the Orange can certainly use a corner. Seems like it would be a good fit. Why haven't they offered him? And I have two theories on this, and I don't have sourcing on it, but I have two theories. You can believe one, you can believe the other, you can believe neither, you can believe both. Number one theory, the NIL for him is ridiculous. Like I said, he was a starter at Georgia. And he's got a ton of offers from a ton of big-time schools. He's going to get a lot of money. Maybe he's too much. Maybe Syracuse is like, let's just pivot. Let's go in a different direction because it's not worth spending all that money on a corner, especially when the team needs a quarterback. So there's no point in trying. That's my number one theory. My other theory is this. and this one might be more plausible, honestly. Fran Brown knows something. He couldn't easily know something about a kid like Julian Humphrey because he was the DB coach at Georgia. He obviously knows him. Maybe the connection isn't super strong. Maybe Fran Brown, he knows him. So maybe he just doesn't want him. Just because he knows him doesn't mean he's going to want him. Those are my two theories. Maybe the NIL is ridiculous or Fran Brown knows something. Once again, they haven't offered Julian Humphrey, and I guess that means he will not be an option in the portal for Syracuse. So the three big topics that I have, Kaidon Salter visiting. I think he's the number one priority of the guys that Syracuse is linked to in the portal at quarterback. Penn running back Malachi Hosley is scheduling a visit sometime. I don't know exactly when, but 24/7 Sports reported that. And Julian Humphrey's in the portal, but Syracuse is not offered. If there's anything else that I am missing, feel free to comment in the comment section below, and I'd be happy to answer your question. One other thing, it literally came across right as I was about to hit the record button. An Alabama offensive tackle, I think he was a backup. Either he's getting a visit from Syracuse or he's been offered. I'm not sure, but 24/7 Sports reported that. So I'll keep an eye on that as well. As far as what is coming up on the podcast in the future, I don't know if there will be a full podcast tomorrow because I will be traveling, but there could be a mini podcast or two coming your way. I talked about with Kyle McCord finishing 10th in the Heisman voting. That's pretty significant. He had a terrific year. Also, basketball-related content. I know basketball-related content that's not a post-game reaction. Yeah, I'm thinking about doing something about Chris Bell. He had some pretty interesting comments to the media, so maybe I'll dive into them. But that's what's probably coming up on the Locked On Syracuse podcast in the future. And of course, if there's any breaking news, like if Kaidon Salter were to commit sometime in the next few hours, I guess it could happen. Technically, he just visited, but he is visiting Colorado soon as well. I'll be here for you on the Locked On Syracuse podcast. Thank you for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen today. And for your second listen, you can check out the Locked On ACC podcast. Alex Dono and Kenton Gibbs, they keep it real. They bring you the truth about where your favorite ACC team stands within the conference. You can find Locked On ACC on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Folks, thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for listening. If you like this video, click that like button. If you really liked it, subscribe to the channel. Turn on those notifications so you know right away when I am dropping the next podcast. And take care, everyone.